The house on the hill had once been the envy of the town, its wide, sun-drenched verandas and manicured gardens sprawling across acres of green, the stone walls dignified and solemn against the sky. People used to stop on the winding road below just to catch a glimpse through the trees, whispering about the man who owned it. But years passed and the whispers faded. The gardens overgrew. The iron gate rusted on its hinges. And the man himself, Thomas Everhart, withdrew from the world so completely that it was said not even time dared knock on his door. His money remained intact and untouched. Investments, trusts, portfolios stacked neatly in fireproof drawers. But wealth meant nothing when the halls were silent and the only footsteps belonged to housekeepers who never looked him in the eye and nurses who rotated shifts as quickly as the seasons. He was in his 70s now, body thinned by illness, once commanding voice reduced to a rasp. No family visited, no friends remained. To the hospital staff, Thomas was just another patient in room 214 of the private ward. He didn't want conversation, he didn't want sympathy, he wanted efficient care and distance. Orders, not kindness. Until Alina was assigned the night shift. She was 32, steady in her movements, eyes the color of Riverstone. The other nurses said she was too soft-hearted, that she took patients home in her thoughts, carried their sorrows in her shoulders. But they also said she never missed a detail, that she could calm the most agitated dementia patient with nothing more than the hush of her voice. Alina didn't argue. She just clocked in, pulled her hair into a low bun, and went to room 214 with a quiet knock. Thomas barely looked up. His face, lined with years of bitterness and something unspoken, was turned toward the window. Rain tapped against the glass. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the lemon polished the cleaner used on the wooden floor. "Mr. Everhart," she said gently, "I'm Alina. I'll be taking care of you tonight." He made a sound in his throat, part grunt, part dismissal. She checked his IV, adjusted the settings, and moved around the room with the kind of grace that comes from knowing how not to disturb someone who does not want to be seen. She didn't try to make him talk. She just did her job, humming under her breath now and then. A lullaby, maybe. He didn't recognize the tune. Hours passed. He dozed, then woke coughing. She was there with water. He refused it. She left it on the bedside anyway. He took a sip once she wasn't looking. That first night she stayed 20 minutes after her shift ended. No one noticed but the security guard, who nodded when she passed with tired feet and a calm face. The next night she was back. Again, she lingered after her shift. Thomas began to watch her discreetly at first. The way she sat beside him to chart on her tablet, legs crossed neatly at the ankle. The way she refilled his water before he asked. The way she never tried to talk to him unless he wanted to talk. He hadn't spoken to anyone in more than polite phrases for over a year. But one night, while she was rearranging the flowers the housekeeping staff had left from the week before, he said, "Those are dead." She turned, holding one brittle stem. "They are. I was hoping you wouldn't notice." A pause. "Too late." Her mouth curved, but she didn't smile with her teeth. "I'll bring new ones tomorrow." He almost asked why she cared, but instead he said, "Don't bother." "I want to." And that was that. She brought fresh flowers, daisies. The next week she brought a book and left it on the table near his bed, The Old Man and the Sea. He didn't touch it at first. But one night, when the ward was quiet and the ache in his bones kept him from sleeping, he read the first 10 pages, then the next 20. He finished it by morning and never told her, but she noticed the bookmark had moved. The day after, she brought To Kill a Mockingbird. Weeks passed like that. Her shifts weren't always assigned to him, but she often traded with the others to ensure she'd be on nights when he was. She never said why. The other nurses shrugged. Let her. He was a grump after all. If she wanted to be the one to deal with him, they didn't mind. But Alina saw something in him. Not pity, not charity, just a quiet ache. A man who had once been something, someone, and had lost too much to find his way back. She saw it in his eyes during the moments he thought no one was watching. A flicker of longing for a world he'd shut out, even if he no longer remembered how to open the door. One night she came in looking tired. Her hands were red from the cold. The heater in her car had broken, and she'd parked in the far lot. "Thomas noticed. You should get that fixed." She looked up from checking his vitals. "I will, when I can afford it." "You work. You're here every night." She chuckled. "Nurses aren't paid what they're worth, Mr. Everhart. Surely you know that." He frowned. He did. He had once owned half a dozen companies, dictated salaries, negotiated bonuses. But the reality of her life, the strain around her eyes, felt sharper than the numbers he used to throw across boardroom tables. He said nothing more, but 2 days later, when she arrived, the parking attendant told her to use the reserved spot by the entrance. No explanation, just a name on a placard, E. Rivera. She stood in the lot for a full minute, staring at it. When she asked the supervisor, she was told it came from higher up. She knew what that meant. She found Thomas half asleep, but his mouth twitched at the corners when she walked in. "I didn't need special treatment," she murmured. "I didn't ask if you did." She let it go. She stayed 30 minutes after her shift that night, told him a story about her childhood in a small coastal town where the wind always smelled like salt and guava trees lined the schoolyard. He didn't ask questions, but he listened. It was the first time in years he hadn't felt like a burden. When winter deepened and his condition worsened, he started having episodes, confusion, breathlessness, memories turning to fog. One night, he mistook a nurse for his long-dead brother and shouted at her until she left in tears. He spent the next day silent, guilt heavy as lead in his chest. When Alina arrived, she said nothing about it, just brought him warm socks she'd knitted herself. "You think I'm a charity case," he muttered. "No," she said, "I think you're cold." He stared at her and something unfamiliar tugged at his throat. Not anger, not pride, something smaller, quieter. He wore the socks that night. As the months passed, they began to speak more. He told her stories from when he was younger, about the sailboat he lost in a storm, the summer he spent in Florence with a woman who smelled like jasmine, the way his father once told him that wealth meant nothing if no one waited for you to come home. Alina told him about her younger brother, about the mother she cared for until the cancer took her, about the way grief never left, just changed shape. Some nights when the pain was too much and the morphine made him restless, she'd read aloud to him until his breathing evened out. Other nights they sat in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of understanding. And though she never said it, she began to see him as something more than a patient. A man, yes, but also a mirror, of what life can become when love is lost, and what it might become again when love is quietly returned. By the time the crocuses bloomed in the courtyard garden, the nurses began to say he'd changed. Less gruff, more present, he'd begun asking for Alina by name. The other nurses noticed, so did the doctors, but no one said a word. Because something was happening in room 214. And everyone knew enough not to interrupt it. Spring brought a softness to the city. The trees outside the hospital flushed pink and white, and the scent of lilacs sometimes slipped in through the opened windows of the ward. Alina noticed that Thomas had started asking for the window to be cracked open in the afternoons, even if the breeze made his hands tremble under the blanket. "I like the air," he told her once as she adjusted the angle of his bed. "Reminds me I'm still part of it." She didn't say anything, but her hand lingered a moment on his wrist after she checked his pulse, steady and slow beneath her fingers. The nurses joked that Alina had become the Everhart whisperer, and though they meant it with affection, none of them quite understood the way the quiet between her and Thomas had changed. It wasn't just professional, and it wasn't romance, not yet, but it was something rare. A bond built not on need or obligation, but on recognition. She saw him and he knew it. One afternoon, Alina came in earlier than usual, her hair loose from the bun she usually wore. Her eyes were tired, but there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there the day before. "Something happened," he said, watching her settle beside him. She raised an eyebrow. "You've become terribly observant." "I've always been observant, just didn't have anything worth noticing." That made her laugh, a soft sound that filled the sterile room with something warmer. "My brother got the job he wanted, the one out of state, he called this morning." "And you're happy for him?" "I am, but I'm also sad. We haven't been apart since, well, since we were kids, really." Thomas looked at her. "You'll miss him." She nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How joy and sorrow can sit side by side and not tear each other apart." He stared at her hands folded in her lap. "You get used to it, the weight of both." She wanted to ask him who he had missed once, who he had carried grief for, but the question stayed behind her teeth. He would tell her if he ever wanted to. He was a man who had learned to survive in silence. She would not demand sound from him now. That night she stayed after her shift again, but instead of reading to him, they played cards. He had a small deck in the drawer of his bedside table, and she found it by accident while looking for gauze. "You play?" she asked, holding it up. He gave a half smile. "Not in years." So they played rummy, slowly, clumsily at first, until the rhythm returned. He beat her twice and gloated like a boy. She accused him of stacking the deck. He told her he would never cheat someone who knits socks by hand. It was the first time he laughed, not a scoff or a low grunt, but a true laugh startled from his chest. She paused and looked at him. "I like that sound," she said. He blinked, the joy retreating into something more guarded. "Haven't heard it myself in a long time." "Well," she said, reshuffling the cards, "I think it suits you." Something softened in him again. The following week, Thomas had a fall during the early morning shift. He tried to reach for his cane on his own stubborn pride, he later admitted, and slipped. The nurse on duty called for assistance, and he was helped back into bed, but not before bruising his hip badly. When Alina arrived later that evening, she found him pale and angry. "I told them I didn't need help," he said, voice rough with shame. "You do," she said calmly, checking the charts. "Everyone does sometimes." He looked away. "I hate being this way." "I know." The acknowledgement settled between them without pressure. She helped him adjust, her fingers gentle as she pressed a cold pack to his side. He winced. "This body used to run half marathons," he muttered. "I believe you. I was strong. You still are." His eyes flicked to hers. "That's a nice lie." "It's not a lie," she said. "It's just a different kind of strong now." He said nothing, but that night when she read to him, he watched her more than the book. He studied the curve of her brow as she concentrated, the quiet inflection in her voice. He once been surrounded by people who smiled when he entered a room, who nodded and bowed and flattered, but no one had looked at him the way she did, as if he were worth staying for even when there was nothing left to gain. The bruising faded, but the fall changed something in Thomas. He started to talk more about the past, about the woman he had loved and lost. "Her name was Margaret," he said one evening. "We were married for 26 years. She died on a Tuesday, pancreatic cancer, quiet and cruel." Alina listened without interrupting. She always knew when to stay silent, when to let the truth arrive in its own time. "I didn't handle it well," he went on. "I shut everything down, sold the house, moved out here, thought maybe the stillness would feel like peace. It didn't." She reached for his hand just lightly enough to anchor him. "Grief has its own tide, it pulls us whether we want it to or not." "I think I drowned," he whispered, "and no one noticed." "I noticed," she said. The next night he was tired and barely spoke, but he reached for her hand first. As summer approached, he began requesting his meals in the courtyard when the weather allowed. Alina joined him when she could, and on one golden evening, she brought a small picnic basket with fresh strawberries and shortbread. "You've been spoiling me," he said. She smiled. "I think you deserve a little spoiling." "I never used to believe in second chances," he said, eyes on the horizon, "but lately, I wonder." Alina turned to him. "It's never too late for second chances or third ones." He looked at her like he wanted to say something more, but the moment passed. A week later, her schedule changed, a staffing issue. She was moved to the pediatric floor, and another nurse was placed in charge of room 214. Thomas asked for her every evening. The others said she'd been reassigned. He grew quiet again. He refused meals. He didn't speak. 3 days passed, then 4. On the fifth night, Alina showed up after her shift ended, still in scrubs, hair damp from a quick shower in the staff locker. He turned his head slowly when she walked in. His eyes shone. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want to leave. They didn't give me a choice." "You came back." "I will always come back." He closed his eyes for a moment. "You're the first person who has." She sat beside him, took his hand again, and they stayed like that until the sun began to rise. Something had shifted. Not in a grand, cinematic way, but in the quiet certainty of two souls who had found in each other the one thing they'd thought was long gone, the comfort of being seen and the safety of being known. And neither of them wanted to let go of that now. By the time summer settled in fully, room 214 looked different. Alina had brought in a small radio, the kind with a warm analog dial. Most evenings, low jazz or soft classical music hummed through the air. A fern now sat near the window, leaves green and reaching toward the light. The nurses called it the Everhart Room when they passed reports. They knew who really kept the place alive. Thomas was sitting upright more now, thinner than before, but somehow more alert. There was color in his cheeks some days, and he asked for more than toast with his breakfast. But the doctors were honest with him. His heart was failing. His body was beginning to fade in ways that couldn't be delayed much longer. He knew, and so did Alina. But neither of them named it aloud. Instead, they began to build something in the quiet space between knowing and hoping. It wasn't the kind of love people wrote songs about. There were no declarations, no kisses beneath fireworks. It was found in the way she adjusted his pillow just right, the way he saved the last strawberry from his fruit cup so she could have it, the way they sometimes sat without speaking for whole hours and never felt the silence as empty. One Thursday, a volunteer from the hospital came in with a therapy dog, a golden retriever named Max. Alina happened to be on shift, and when she wheeled Max in, Thomas rolled his eyes. I'm dying, not depressed. Alina crouched beside the dog. He doesn't care, he just wants to say hello. The dog padded forward and rested his chin on Thomas's knee, tail sweeping the floor. Thomas didn't move at first. Then slowly he lifted a hand and laid it on the dog's head. The retriever closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. I used to have a dog like this, Thomas murmured, back when I still believed in having things you could lose. Alina said nothing, just sat on the edge of the bed and let the moment settle. Max returned once a week after that, and Thomas began saving tidbits from his lunch tray just in case. Small things changed too. Alina brought in crossword puzzles and found he had a gift for them, even when the medication clouded his mind. She sometimes caught him waiting with pen in hand when she entered the room. I left 17 across for you, he said one evening, as if that simple act held meaning, and it did. In late July he had a particularly difficult night. His breathing was shallow, chest rising in uneven pulls. The nurses tried a new dosage, called the attending. Alina, though off shift, came in when she heard. She found him lying still, eyes closed, mouth dry. Thomas, she said gently, taking his hand, I'm here. He stirred, thought I might go without saying goodbye. Not tonight. He opened his eyes slowly, but someday soon. She didn't argue, instead she laid her cheek beside his hand on the blanket. If it's soon, then let's not waste what's left. That night she sat beside him until morning, reading from a book she'd brought in weeks before but never opened. He drifted in and out, but whenever he woke she was still there, still reading, her voice a steady rhythm against the tide pulling him further out. After that night Thomas asked for one thing. Take me outside, he said, farther than the courtyard, just once. The doctors were hesitant, it wasn't protocol, but he was lucid and the request wasn't impossible. So one warm afternoon, Alina wheeled him out through the long glass doors, down the path that curved along the back of the hospital grounds. Past the parking lot, past the noise, toward the grove of trees that framed the old stone bench no one ever used. They sat in the dappled shade, sun playing through the leaves. Birds moved in and out of the branches above. I used to come to places like this when Margaret was sick, he said. It was the only time I didn't feel like I was failing her. You didn't fail her, Alina said. I wasn't brave enough to stay. Alina turned to him, startled. What do you mean? He was quiet a long time. Then I pulled away before the end. I told myself I needed to be strong, but really I was afraid of watching someone I loved disappear, so I started disappearing first. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. You stayed long enough for her to love you back, that matters. His hand trembled, and what about now? What about it? I'm not disappearing anymore, he said, eyes wet, not with you here. She pressed her lips together, fighting her own tears. Then I'll stay until the end. They sat there until the air cooled and shadows stretched across the grass. When they returned to the hospital, something had shifted again, not in the way of roles, nurse and patient, but something deeper, something neither of them would ever try to name, not out loud. In August, his condition declined sharply. Mornings became harder. He sometimes mistook the nurses for other people, but not Alina, never Alina. He always knew her. One night, as the ward grew quiet and Alina sat beside his bed with a warm cloth in hand, he said, I wish I had met you when I was younger. She smiled, brushing the cloth along his brow. I wouldn't have seen you then, not really. Why not? Because I wasn't ready to see someone like you. He blinked slowly, and now I wouldn't trade a single minute of knowing you. He looked at her with an ache she felt down to her bones. Stay, he said. She stayed. When her shift ended, she stayed. When the sun rose, she was still there, fingers wrapped gently around his, as if willing time to slow down. They both knew it wouldn't. But for now, they didn't let go. By the first days of September, the light outside room 214 began to shift. It poured in at a gentler angle now, gold more than white, casting soft shadows across the bed where Thomas lay thinner, quieter, but still himself. The monitors continued their gentle beeping, oxygen whispered through narrow tubing, and time felt suspended in those hours when Alina sat with him. He no longer ate much, his voice was rougher, gravel caught in each breath, yet he still asked her about her day, still looked up when she entered as though he'd been holding his breath for her footsteps. And she always came. Even when she wasn't scheduled, even when she had barely slept, she came. One Saturday afternoon, he surprised her. "I want to write something down," he said, his voice a tired rasp. "Can you help me?" Of course, she brought paper from the nurse's station and a fountain pen from her own bag. "It's a letter," he said, "to no one in particular, maybe to myself or to her, or maybe it's just something that needs to be said out loud before it's lost." She sat beside him, pen poised. "Whenever you're ready." He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and began. "To the person I was and the person I never became. I want to say I'm sorry. For the years I wore silence like armor. For the way I let fear decide what I could love. For turning grief into isolation. And calling it strength. I once believed money could soften sorrow. That power could shield me from emptiness. I was wrong. What heals us in the end is not control. It's kindness. A hand held without question. A voice that stays through the night. A nurse who sees the man beneath the nameplate. I don't know what waits for me next. But for the first time in a long time, I do not meet it alone. That is more than I ever expected. And everything I ever needed." When he finished, his breath was shaky, and a tear had traced its way into the crease beside his temple. Alina didn't speak. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. "I'll keep it safe," she said. He nodded once, eyelids fluttering closed. Later that week, Alina was called into the director's office. She sat across from a stern-looking woman in a crisp navy blazer, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "There's been a request," the director said, "from Mr. Everhart's estate attorney." Alina's heart stilled. "What kind of request?" "He wants to designate you his medical proxy, effective immediately, and he's also filed to leave you something in his will." Alina stared, stunned. "I didn't ask for any of that," she said quickly. "He doesn't need to." The director held up a hand. "I know, but he's adamant, and frankly it's not unheard of. People form bonds in times like these. He trusts you." That night she found him dozing, the evening light turning his silver hair to soft ash. "You did something without telling me," she said, pulling a chair closer. He opened one eye. "I've been known to make executive decisions." She shook her head. "Why me?" His voice was slow but sure. "Because when the end comes, I want the person who sat with me in the stillness, who never asked for anything, who saw who I was even when I didn't." Her throat tightened. "I'd have stayed even if you had nothing." "I know," he whispered. "That's why I wanted to give you something." She didn't answer. She just reached for his hand and held it long after the sun dipped below the horizon. On the first truly cold morning of fall, Thomas had a good day. He was lucid, alert, even wry. He asked for coffee, real coffee, and winked at Alina when she slipped him a few sips from her thermos. They talked about nothing and everything, about birds and whether or not he would have liked to travel more. He said he had been too afraid of missing something at home and then laughed softly at the irony of that. Before she left to tend to another patient, he caught her wrist lightly. "Alina." She turned. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes a little brighter than usual, "about what comes next." "All right. If you ever feel lost after I'm gone, find the house." She blinked. "What house?" "The one on the hill. I never sold it, just locked the door. Everything's still there. It's quiet, lonely maybe, but it could be something again." She swallowed. "You want me to go there?" "I want someone to open the windows," he said, "to breathe new air into old rooms, to remind it and me that life didn't stop just because I left." She nodded. "Okay, I will." 2 nights later, he didn't wake. The nurses noticed around 3:17 a.m. Alina had just finished checking vitals in another room when the call came. By the time she reached room 214, the monitors were silent. She stood at the threshold, her breath caught in her chest. He lay still, peaceful, hands folded like he was waiting for nothing now. The letter was still in the drawer beside him. She sat beside him one last time, placed her palm on the back of his hand. "You didn't go alone," she whispered. Then she stayed until the first light of dawn crept into the room, the softest gold resting against his face. Not a goodbye, but something like grace. The funeral was private. Alina sat in the second row, hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening as a gray-suited man from the law office spoke a few prepared words. There was no priest, no hymns. Thomas had not wanted any of that. A few hospital staff had come, including the charge nurse from his floor and one of the physical therapists who had once tried to coax him into walking again. The rest of the seats were empty. No family, no old friends. Just Alina, a folded envelope in her purse, and the sound of the wind threading its way through the late autumn trees. Afterward, as the mourners, what few there were, drifted away, the lawyer approached her. His tone was professional but not cold. He left instructions, he said, more than the legal ones, personal ones, letters, items, things he asked me to pass on to you in time. He handed her a leather-bound folder, a key, and a sealed envelope with her name on it. She held them to her chest, nodded once, and turned toward her car, heart heavy with something too deep for words. The house on the hill stood just as he described it. Set back behind a rusted iron gate, windows shuttered, ivy climbing the stone like it had been waiting for someone to return. Alina stood outside for a long time, hand on the key in her coat pocket. The early November air was cool but not biting. A few yellow leaves clung stubbornly to the trees above. She unlocked the door. The air inside smelled of dust and old pine wood and something else, lemon polish, faint and fading like the ghost of a memory. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, catching dust motes in its beam. The furniture was covered in white cloths, but beneath them the shape of a life remained. She walked slowly from room to room. A photograph on the mantel showed Thomas and a woman with laughing eyes, Margaret, no doubt standing in front of the same fireplace. There were books lining the shelves, spines worn, corners folded. A set of worn slippers still rested beside an armchair. In the back, through double doors, she found the garden, wild and tangled but not dead. Roses, despite everything, had survived the seasons. She stayed there for a long time. Later, she opened the envelope. It was his handwriting, shaky but deliberate. If you're reading this, it means I am no longer where you can see me. But if I've learned anything in these last months, it's that love doesn't end when a heart stops beating. It continues, quietly, persistently, in those we've touched, in the kindness we give and receive. You gave me the only thing I ever truly wanted, not pity, not help, just presence. I once believed no one would sit beside me again. You did. There's a part of this house that still remembers joy. I hope you find it. And when you do, I hope you stay. Alina read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and walked through the house again, slower this time, like listening for the echo of a heartbeat. Weeks passed. Alina took a leave from the hospital, not because she couldn't bear to go back, but because she needed time to remember how to be still, how to be quiet without grief clinging to every breath. She started with the garden. Each morning she pulled on gloves, tugged weeds from the cracked flagstone path, trimmed branches, whispered to the flowers like they were patients waking from a long sleep. Neighbors noticed. One afternoon, a woman in her 60s paused at the gate. I used to see the man who lived there, she said, but then no one. He was here, Alina said softly, you just didn't see him anymore. The woman nodded and offered to help with the roses. They worked side by side in the cool light, and when they finished, the yard looked almost alive again. Later that evening, Alina sat on the porch steps, watching the breeze shift through the trees. And for the first time since Thomas's last breath, she smiled without sorrow behind it. Winter came, snow dusted the rooftops like powdered sugar, and the house, once hollow, began to carry the sound of footsteps again. Inside, Alina set up a small reading nook in the sunroom. Books from Thomas's collection lined the shelves, along with a few she brought from home. She drank coffee in the mornings at the window, steam curling from the mug, his old radio murmuring softly in the background. Sometimes she read aloud. Not because anyone was there to hear her, but because it felt right. As though something of him still lingered, listening. She had dreams where he walked beside her in the garden, saying little, just nodding at her work with a faint smile. In one dream, he handed her a daisy. In another, he sat on the bench and watched the sky. She woke from those dreams with tears on her cheeks, but not the painful kind, the kind that came from missing someone who had changed her. Someone who had seen her too. One evening, a letter came. From a young man named Evan, living out of state. He had just learned through a genealogical service that Thomas Everhart had been his great-uncle. His grandmother had been estranged from the family, but records led him to the estate. He had no claim to anything, he wrote, but wanted to know the man he'd never met, even just a little. Alina answered. She wrote of the man she'd known, not the tycoon or the reclusive millionaire, but the one who'd learned to speak again when someone stayed. She included a copy of the letter Thomas had written, and a photograph from the garden, roses blooming around the old bench. Weeks later, Evan came to visit. He stood at the edge of the path, young and curious, and Alina saw in his face a trace of the man she had known. Not the features, but the eyes, that same glint of quiet longing, of someone who wanted to be known. She invited him in. The house, once empty, opened its doors again. In the years that followed, Alina remained. She returned to nursing eventually, part-time at first, but she always came back to the house. The windows stayed open in the summer, the fireplace warm in the winter, friends gathered in the garden for tea, for music, for remembering, and always the porch light was left on. Not for ghosts, but for grace, for second chances, and for the quiet miracle of love that asks for nothing but your presence. Thomas had once feared he would die with no one beside him. But in the end, someone stayed. And in staying, she brought his life back into the world, not with fanfare, but with flowers blooming in wild corners, with stories passed through hands, and with a house that no longer waited alone on the hill. It remembered him, because she remembered him. And love, when witnessed fully, does not end. Not even after the last breaths.